Well, good morning, church.
Good morning.
Let's pray. Father God, as we quiet our hearts, I just ask, Lord, that you would open them even wider, Lord, to hear what you would say today. Open our minds, Lord, to hear your voice. God, may your Holy Spirit just rest upon us. May what's heard in the next few minutes, Lord, just penetrate deeply. May we not leave this room the same way we came in. Help us to leave changed, more aware of who you are and what you do in our lives. In Christ's name. I don't know if you read Our Daily Bread. I do off and on. And one of the things that I noticed a few days ago was an article in Our Daily Bread where a lady was talking about her nephew who had been misbehaving. And her little 3-year-old, he had done something, he had gotten into trouble, and he knew he was in trouble. He knew he had done wrong. But like a lot of little 3-year-olds, 3-year-old logic, when things went wrong, he closed his eyes, figuring that if he couldn't see his aunt couldn't see him. Right? You know, you can't see me. I'm hiding from you. And we know that that's silly. We know that that's crazy. But in some ways, I think we do that. We do that in some ways from God. We think we can hide from God. We think that maybe He can't see us, you know, if we just ignore Him, or if we're just, no, you can't see me, Lord. The thing is that our God sees, right? Our God sees everything. Our God knows everything. Aren't you glad? Now, some of you might go, well, maybe not, you know. Maybe not. Maybe I don't want some of the things, but if you actually follow it to all the way, aren't you glad that there is someone who knows you better than you even know yourself, and who cares for you, and who loves you, warts and all? The title of this sermon is The God Who Sees. And our memory verse is Genesis 16:13. It says this: "She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I've now seen the one who sees me." Now, if you don't know where this comes from, this is Hagar, the servant of Sarai at this time. And she's run away from her mistress. Sarai, which we will know later as Sarah, cannot get pregnant. And so she has her maid go to her husband, Abram, who will later be called Abraham. And she ends up getting pregnant. But Hagar kind of looks down on Sarah after that. And because of this, Sarah mistreats her. And so you have Hagar running into the wilderness. She's running away from her mistress. And she's alone, and she's scared, and she's pregnant. And God comes to her. And God comforts her. And Hagar gives him this name, El Roi, the God who sees. The God who sees me. This year, our theme is seeing the world through Christ's eyes. And during this week, this is actually a two-part sermon. Next week we will be more focusing on through Christ's eyes. But Pastor Lau, if you happen to be in the Chinese service as well, he's going to be not doing the same sermon, but on the same theme. We've agreed that that's what we want to focus on. We want to talk about this year's theme, seeing the world through Christ's eyes. Now, you might say, well, is it through Christ's eyes, Christ sees, or through God's eyes, the Father? Look at John 1 through 5. John, when he's talking about Jesus, he begins his book saying this: in the beginning was the Word, Jesus. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same one, I'm doing the one that I memorized, sorry. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. In other words, Jesus in the very beginning was with God and was God, and that is hard for us to understand. And in the Old Testament, quite frankly, it's never distinguished. Even in the New Testament, we begin to get ideas of it. And it's not until about the 4th century that man's understanding of the Trinity gets a little clearer. Okay, so for our intents and purposes, we are not going to divide out the Trinity. We're not going to be able to, this, that, and whoever, right? So when I say through Christ's eyes, through God's eyes, I'm talking about the same one, the same person. Okay? So let's not get caught up in that distinction. And in fact, all through the Bible, we see that God sees us. Christ sees us where we are. We see that, and we also know that sometimes He lends us His eyes. Sometimes we can see others the way God sees others. But unfortunately, often you and I, we only see the surface, don't we? I mean, I look out here, and what do I see? I see a bunch of men and women, some of you boys and girls too. Boys and girls say, wait a minute, we're men and women too. But I look out here and I see people with different hairstyles and different clothing styles and different attitudes. Some of you are thin, some of you are fat. What? So what? What do you mean by? Some of you are pleasantly plump like me. And I can see that surface and I can judge you. I can categorize you. I can say, well, this is a good student. This is a bad student. This is a smart kid. This is maybe not so. This person is a nice person. I can look at that smile. I can tell they're a nice person. This person, man, they're grouchy. They're grumpy. And people do that to us all the time. They judge us by the way we look, the color of our skin, how tall we are, how short we are, how well educated we are, what gender we are. We see circumstances. We judge by the attitudes, the words, the actions. These blind us. These blind us to the truth of who the person is inside. See, the person is not the attitudes. The person is not the actions. The person is not the outer appearance. The person is something else. The person is the one that Jesus Christ died for. The person is the one that Jesus loves. The person is the one that God created and spun into existence. And the person is the one that we need to be looking for and that God sees. He sees the other stuff too, don't get me wrong. But He sees us, the real us. You see, first and foremost, God sees the potential. God sees the potential in a person. Many people are written off by us as failures. Maybe you've been written off as a failure. Maybe people look at you and have categorized you to the point that they say, this girl or this guy, they're never going to succeed. They're never going to go anywhere in life. You ever feel that way? That maybe people are judging you? Maybe people have decided where you're going? There's a guy years ago in Indiana, a young boy. He was the oldest of his siblings. At the age of 5, his dad died. So at 7, his mom was off working, sometimes days at a time. And he was having to take care of his younger siblings at 7. Making sure they got food, making sure they were clean, etc. By the age of 10, he was working as a farmhand. By the age of 14, or 13, his mother had remarried and the stepfather was no great shakes. And so he left home. And he ended up painting horse carriages. By 14, he was a farmhand again. But he was always restless. He was always restless. He had a hot temper. And he was looking for something and he couldn't really find it in life. He started going job to job. He worked as a fireman, not the kind you're thinking. Firemen in those days were on a train where they took the coal and they shoveled it into the furnace so that the steam engine would go faster, right? He worked with that. He emptied ashes. He at one time was a streetcar conductor. He went from job to job. He lied about his age and got into the Army and honorable discharge a year later. Some people say because maybe they found out how actually young he was. He tended to get into fights. For instance, like one of the times when he was working as a fireman, he lost his job because he got in a fist fight with somebody. He ended up studying law by correspondence course, like a mail-in course, right? Studied law. Ended up practicing for 3 years, but also lost that career because he got in a fight with his client during a case. He got in a shootout with a guy over a competitor. I mean, just lots of things. Always in trouble, it seems. Always searching. He went from job to job to job, oftentimes just leaving them because he got bored, but sometimes because he lost it because of insubordination or whatever. If you were to look at this person and say, hey, he was coming to you for a job, would you hire him, knowing this job history? No. Would you look at this guy and you'd say, hey man, he's a success? No. He's a failure. So we categorize him. The next 3-4 decades, he just bounced from one thing to another. Sometimes really successful, a lot of times not. Finally, at age 65, he retired. He took his savings and he took his $105 a month Social Security check. And he packed his now wife, it used to be his mistress, was now his wife. And they got in the car and they started traveling to restaurant because you see in all his different career paths, he had learned a secret of how to cook chicken and a really good spice recipe. His name's Colonel Sanders of Kentucky Fried Chicken. And Colonel Sanders, by the time he was in his 70s, was a very well-known guy. But he still wasn't a success. Commercially, yeah. But he was still restless. He was still searching. Until late in his 70s, he found Jesus. And suddenly, everything clicked. He and his wife were baptized in the River Jordan, and he became a new man. but no one would have seen it except God in all those years. God sees beyond the circumstances of the person's life, beyond your parents, beyond your education, beyond everything, and He sees you. And a classic example of this in the Bible is Joshua. Joshua is in the shadow of Moses through a lot of the book of Exodus beginning. He's Moses' young aide. He's just a kid. He goes fetches things for Moses. But by Exodus 17, he's beginning to take leadership roles. He's actually out fighting when the Amalekites attack. He's the one leading the army. And we see this interesting thing in Exodus 17:14. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this on a scroll as something to be remembered," and listen to this, "and make sure that Joshua hears it. Because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven." Now at this point you go, okay, it's all about Amalek, etc. But why is Joshua there? Why does Joshua hear it? Why, when Moses goes up into the mountain, does Joshua go along? Why, whenever God's presence comes down on the tent of meeting and Moses goes in to talk with him, why is it when Moses goes and leaves, Joshua's still at the door? Because God has plans for Joshua. Even though everybody else is looking at Joshua, this is just Moses' young age. The Bible says he's been with him since he was a kid. God sees something else. Look at Numbers 27:18. So the Lord said to Moses, "Take Joshua son of Nun, a man in whom is the spirit of leadership, and lay your hands on him." Because God is seeing the future. God sees the potential. God knows where He's going. And God needs those who are unafraid to lead the charge in life. Unafraid to go out and do great things for Him. But Joshua needed more than just leadership skills to guide these people. Look at Deuteronomy 34:9. Now Joshua son of Nun was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses. Once again, you see this man developing. This man coming up because God has His hand on him. And most importantly, God saw in Joseph a man who was dedicated completely to Him. I don't want to spend too much time on this because we've got a lot to do. But if you ever have a chance to go back and read the life of Joshua, it's amazing how God is working with this guy and taking this man and just building him into the leader that he's eventually going to be. And by the time we get to the end of his life in Joshua 24:14-15, we see this. Now fear the Lord. Joshua's telling his people because he's led them. Moses didn't get to enter the promised land. Joshua leads the people into the promised land, and they fight those wars. And at the end, Joshua says, "Now fear the Lord and serve Him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." This is a man who's gone from just a kid to a guy completely sold out and living for God. Do we see the potential in others like that? When you look at the people next to you in this room, some of you are teachers, some of you are going to be teachers, some of you are Connect leaders, some of you, Joshua, you have the youth, and Jessica, you have the youth. When you look at the people there, do you see the potential? Or do you see the behaviors? Do you see the attitudes right now? Or do you see what God may be doing with this person? And maybe what your role is. What your role might be in helping to shape this person and who they are going to be tomorrow. So God sees our potential, but in addition, God sees beyond our insecurities. Now, our insecurities are our doubts and our fears. And I don't know about you, but I have a few. Anybody have doubts and fears in here? Yeah, of course we do. We may put on a good face, but all of us have our own doubts, our own insecurities, our own fears about the future, about our family. One of the biggest fearful doubters in the Bible was a guy by the name of Gideon. Gideon was a doubter. Now he lived in a time where there was a lot to fear. Because he lived in a time period where the Israelites had been running away from God. And because of that, the Midianites and the Amalekites were beating them up all the time. In fact, they had to build themselves shelters in caves, etc., to be able to get away from them a lot of times. Every time they would plant crops, here would come the Midianites and the Amalekites, and they would take their crops and they'd stomp them out, and they'd take their sheep and their donkeys and everything else. And the Israelites were living in terror of these guys. In fact, it got so bad that they were hiding everything. Even if they're grinding grain, they would hide it someplace so that it couldn't be seen. Look at Judges 6, 11 through 17. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. He's not making wine. He's doing grain there so that, maybe they don't see. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." I love those lines. "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied, "but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the land of Midian." The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh. I'm the least in my family." The Lord answered, "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." Gideon replied, "If now I've found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that is really you talking to me." Gideon is doubting this. It's like, are you crazy? I don't know who you are. But you're coming to me, Lord. And it's like, you look at me, you look at this situation. I don't think so. You ever there? Do you ever feel that sometimes that God may be calling you or asking you something to do? And you feel that you got the wrong guy, bud. You're not listening to the right person here, or talking to the right person, God. There's no way that I can do this. Teach Sunday school, or you're out of your mind? Not me. Go talk to the person in my classroom? Me? But God is speaking to Gideon, even with all his doubts. So, what God does, basically, is God, the Lord who is speaking to him here, basically says, bring this to me, bring the stuff to me. He brings Gideon goes and prepares a feast, basically, a sacrifice, puts it down in front of the Lord, and the Lord says, pour out the broth. When he does it, the Lord takes his staff, pushes it down on the rock, and a fire comes up, takes all the offering up, and then the angel of the Lord disappears. And Gideon's kind of, wow, this is weird. And Gideon builds an altar, his first altar to God. But then God stretches Gideon a bit further. God stretches him a little bit further because he says, here's what I want you to do. He says, I want you to go, and I want you to go to your father's house, and I want you to take that altar that he's built to Baal, and I want you to tear it down. I want you to take that Asherah pole. The Asherah pole was to another goddess. He says, I want you to take this, and I want you to tear it down. And I want you to cut it up, and I want you to use that wood to build me an altar. And take your father's second bull and sacrifice it there. Okay. So Gideon does it, but notice in Judges 6:27 what he does. So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him, because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople. He did it at night rather than in the daytime. You know, I don't know, this is not going to work out, you know, you're telling me to do this. I saw you do the big, you know, poofy thing with the fire and everything, but he does it. And sure enough, the townspeople go bananas. And they want Gideon's blood. And God works it out so that his father says something that calms him down a little bit. But God is going to stretch Gideon even more. Look at Judges 6:33-35. Now all the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples joined forces and crossed over the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord came on Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, summoning the Abiezrites to follow him. He sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also into Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, so that they too went up to meet them. Wow! Gideon's got the message, right? He's full of faith. He's ready to go, right? Nope. Because despite how much Gideon has been stretched, he's still not ready yet. He still doesn't trust God enough. Our hero still has some doubts. Judges 6:36-40. Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised, look, I'll place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there's dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said. And that's what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to God, do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew. That night God did so, only the fleece was dry and all the ground was covered with dew. This is a man who really trusts, right? No! He is fearful, he is doubtful, he has insecurities, just like you and me. Just like you and me. But through this, the incredible patience of God working with Gideon, eventually Gideon learns to trust. And it reminds me about this fact. You know, following God is a process. You and I, we don't have it together at the beginning. You and I are full of doubts and insecurities, but guess what? God sees us. God knows us. He knows your doubts. He knows your insecurities. And he says, okay, I'm still going to work with you. I'm still going to get into your life. I'm going to still help you through this and learn to trust me. So in Judges, we see later on that Gideon is really beginning to trust because 32,000 people end up coming to follow Gideon. But then God says, you know what? The Israelites are going to think they did it all themselves. So here's what I want you to do, Gideon. I want you to ask, how many of these guys are scared? How many think that we're scared of 32,000 people? 22,000 of them. 22,000 of them were scared. He said, send those guys home. So now Gideon's armies from 32,000 is reduced to 10,000. And then he says, well, that's too many. God says, that's too many, Gideon. He says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take these 10,000 guys, and we're going to see which of them that I'm going to choose. He says, have them all come to the river and have them drink. And he says, divide them this way. The ones that kneel down and drink the water. Separate those from the ones who reach down and they cup the water and they lap it like a dog. Notice the difference? There's a bunch of them that are going to kneel in submission. They're going to go down there and drink. And there's some others who are just going to take it up to them and hold it and lap it like a dog. There was only 300 of the 10,000 that did that. And he said, those are the 300 I want. 300 men to go against how many thousands and thousands and thousands of these other enemies. And yet, God works it out. And I'm not going to tell you the story. I want you to go to Judges 7 through 8 if you're curious and read that story yourself. Not right now, please. But read the story of what God does through this man in his insecurities and doubts who's finally learned to really trust God. Are you trapped by your insecurities? Give them to God. Trust Him. See, God sees our potential. He sees beyond our insecurities, but He also God sees past our weaknesses. God sees past our weaknesses. Who was possibly the weakest man in the Bible? Weakest man that God ever used. Yeah, it is. Samson. You say, what? Oh, it's Samson? You know, Samson. Big Samson, strong Samson. Yeah, because Samson was physically strong, but he was personally weak. He was weak. He had a problem with women, for one thing. He had a problem with trying to rely on his own self rather than anybody else. He was coarse, he was foul-mouthed, he did lots of bad things. Not a role model. And at one point, he got to the point where he was so reliant on his own self that even when somebody who was obviously not his friend, Delilah, is continually trying to cajole him to tell her the secret because she's working for the Philistines, Samson, not being the sharpest tool in the shed, ends up telling her. And when he does, he loses his strength. They shave his head. He loses his strength. The Philistines grab him, gouge out his eyes. And they torture him, and they use him as the laughing stock. They chain him up. And he's just the butt of their jokes. Weak. Weak men rely on themselves alone. But see, God sees past the weakness. And He eventually has Samson realize where his strength really comes from. And we see this in Judges 16, 23 through 30. Now the rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon their god, and to celebrate, saying, our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands. When the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, our God has delivered our enemy into our hands, the one who laid waste to our land and multiplied our slain. While they were in high spirits, they shouted, bring out Samson to entertain us. So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. Can you imagine? When they stood him among the pillars, Samson said to the servant who held his hand, put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so that I may lean against them. Now the temple was crowded with men and women. All the rulers of the Philistines were there. And on the roof were about 3,000 men and women watching Samson, this trick pony, perform. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more. And let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Then Samson, reaching toward the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood, bracing himself against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other, Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived. Now you think, wait, all this killing, you know? It's hard for us because we think all this death and everything. But you got to understand that in this time period, the Israelites were at war against the Philistines. And the Philistines weren't there just to fight against the Israelites. They wanted to take them out completely. And not only that, they wanted to take out the memory of God completely. It was all about their God, Dogon, however you want to pronounce it. And they were wanting to wipe out Israel and wipe out God. And it wasn't going to happen. The thing is that even the weakest of us, even people like Samson, can be used by God. One of the other weak guys in the Bible was a guy by the name of Eli. Eli was of the priestly line of Aaron. And Eli had a couple of sons that were also serving as priests under him. But these sons were corrupt, and they're called scoundrels in the Bible. They would use their priestly office in a bad way. They would take what was supposed to be offered to God, and they would eat it. And they would do things like they would sleep with the women that were outside. I mean, they were corrupt. They were terrible men. And even though a father cannot control everything their children do, Eli could have stopped this because these guys were priests underneath him. But instead, all Eli would do would scold them a little bit, saying, "What you guys are not doing is right. It's wrong." He didn't do anything about it. And so we see in 1 Samuel 2, 27 to 29. Now a man of God came to Eli and said to him, "This is what the Lord says. Did I not clearly reveal myself to your ancestors' family when they were in Egypt under Pharaoh? I chose your ancestor out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar to burn incense, and to wear an ephod in my presence. I also gave your ancestors' family all the food offerings presented by the Israelites. Why do you scorn my sacrifice and offering that I prescribed for my dwelling? Why do you honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choice parts of every offering made by my people Israel?" So, we have a man who is weak. A man who, because of his inaction, is allowing God's name to be besmirched. But yet God uses this weak man to mentor and guide Samuel, who is going to be one of the strongest lights in that time period for God. We are weak, but thankfully, God is strong. Because God sees our potential. He sees beyond our insecurities. He sees past our weaknesses to use us, and God sees our hearts. We put on a lot of masks. We try to fool people. But God sees the real us. The Israelites had asked for a king to be like everyone else, and they got one. They got Saul, who started out well, but pretty soon Saul was going his own way. And so Samuel is sent to anoint another one. And in 1 Samuel 16, 6 through 7, we see this. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance. The Lord looks at the heart. You and I, we look at the outward appearance. But the Lord looks at the heart. Because of that, when the Lord is looking at the heart, Samuel anoints David, who we later learn is a man after God's own heart. Even though David is going to fall, even though he's going to commit adultery and murder and all these things, he still is a man after God's own heart. And God, even in David's weakness, is going to use him. So you might say, well, we've seen all of this kind of stuff, these stories, but what does this have to do with us seeing things through God's eyes, through Christ's eyes? The thing is I really believe that God oftentimes allows us, as we learn to walk with Him, as we learn to get closer to Him, I believe that God allows us to see others around us through God's eyes. To really see their potential, to see beyond their insecurities, beyond their weaknesses. But we come to the big questions, are you willing? Are you willing to see God? Are you willing to see as God sees? Are you willing to look at the people in your life right now and to see them as God sees them? Are you willing to look beyond the outer stuff that may irritate you or annoy you? Your family, your friends, your brothers, your sisters, your classmates, your bosses, your teachers. Are you willing to look beyond that? To try to see them through God's eyes. To really see the hearts. To see their potential. To see beyond their insecurities. To see past their weaknesses. And to see them as people that Jesus died for. Are you willing to love others like God loves you? And secondly, are you willing to even see yourself that way? Because we get trapped. We get trapped with this self-image of like, well, I can't do it. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not educated enough. I'm not this. I'm not that. Are you willing to see that God sees you differently than you see yourself? Are you willing to look at how God sees you? You say, well, how do I do that? The only way you can do that is by getting closer to Him. By learning to love Him. By learning to love others. Learning to see through His eyes. You may have given up on yourself. You may have given up on others. But that doesn't mean that God has given up. Maybe you're a Gideon. Maybe you're an Eli. Maybe you're a Hagar. I don't know. Don't give up. Let's pray. Father God, I realized that there was a lot to unpack in this sermon. Because we're looking at history and we're looking at men and women, Lord, who are people just like us. People who have failed. People who occasionally have some successes. But people that you have seen into their lives and seen that they can be used. People that you died for. And that you love and pray. Lord, help us not to reject ourselves and reject others out of hand. Help us not to judge. But instead help us to see people the way you see them. To see them through your eyes. And help us to allow ourselves to be used by you to help bring out that person that they're meant to be. Guide us to be your servants and to really see the world as you see it. In Christ's name.
We're going to go into a time of offering. If this is your first time here, you don't have to give. Don't feel like you're obligated to give.